If you see a black SUV waiting in the rain, don't run toward it, unless you have nowhere else to go. Claire Bennett learned that at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the storm rolled in without warning and turned the city streets into rivers of reflected neon and blurred headlights, when her worn sneakers slipped against wet pavement as she hurried out of the late shift at a downtown cafe, her jacket thin, her body exhausted, and her mind already racing ahead to the small apartment 12 blocks away where her 6-year-old son was waiting with a babysitter she could barely afford, where every dollar mattered and every minute counted, because Ethan needed his medication on time and the world didn't slow down for mothers who couldn't keep up. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, fingers cold, breath visible in the damp air, and for a moment everything felt almost normal. Just another night, just another shift, just another quiet struggle no one noticed, until she sensed it. That subtle shift in the rhythm of the street, the feeling that something, or someone, had decided to pay attention. She glanced over her shoulder once, quick, instinctive, saw nothing but passing cars and rain slicing through the glow of streetlights, but the feeling stayed, clinging to her spine like a whisper she couldn't hear clearly, so she walked faster, turning down a side street she always used as a shortcut, narrow, dimly lit, lined with brick walls and closed storefronts, the kind of place people ignored, the kind of place she had learned to move through quickly without looking. Afraid, because fear had a way of inviting trouble, and she couldn't afford trouble. Not with a child depending on her, not with rent already 3 days late, not with the quiet pressure of bills stacking up like a countdown she couldn't stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably the babysitter checking in, but she didn't stop to answer. Not yet, not here. She just kept walking, steady, controlled, until the sound came, footsteps. Not loud, not rushed, but there, behind her, matching her pace in a way that made her heart tighten just enough to matter. She didn't turn this time, didn't break her rhythm, just adjusted her grip on her bag and kept moving forward like nothing had changed, because sometimes pretending nothing was wrong was the only way to keep it from becoming real. Except it was real. She knew it, felt it in the way the air shifted, in the way the street suddenly felt too empty, too quiet, too exposed, and then she saw it, at the end of the alley, parked where it shouldn't have been, a black SUV, engine running, headlights off, waiting, not like a car looking for someone, but like something that already knew exactly who it was there for. Claire slowed, just slightly, her mind calculating distances, exits, options, the way she always did, because survival had become a skill she practiced every day. And then the rear door opened, smooth, deliberate, revealing a silhouette inside, still, composed, watching, and for a second the rain seemed to quiet around her, like the city itself was holding its breath. Claire stopped completely now, not out of fear, but because something deeper told her running wouldn't help, not this time. And then the man stepped out, tall, controlled, his dark coat untouched by the chaos of the storm, his presence changing the space around him in a way that didn't need explanation. Adrian Volkov didn't look at the rain, didn't look at the street, he looked only at her, as if she had been the destination all along, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, certain, carrying just enough weight to make everything else fade. You shouldn't be walking alone this late. And Claire, exhausted, soaked, and far too tired to pretend anymore, met his gaze without stepping back. Because for the first time that night, the fear she felt wasn't about the footsteps behind her, it was about the man standing in front of her, and the quiet certainty that this moment was about to change everything. Claire did not move, not because she trusted him, but because something in the way he stood there made running feel pointless, like trying to outrun a storm that had already decided where it would land. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets, soaking through her jacket, dripping from her hair, but Adrian Volkov looked untouched by it all, as if the weather had chosen not to bother him, and that alone told her more than any introduction could. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. I have been walking alone like this for years, she said, not defensive, not afraid, just stating a fact the way people did when they had no luxury left for anything else. His gaze did not shift, not even slightly, but something behind his eyes changed, subtle, calculating, like he was adjusting a decision she could not see. That does not mean you should, he replied, calm, controlled. And the way he said it made it sound less like advice and more like a rule the world had simply failed to enforce until now. Claire exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay grounded, because she knew this type of moment, knew how quickly things could spiral if she showed the wrong emotion, said the wrong word. She glanced briefly past him, toward the open street beyond the SUV, half expecting to see the shadow of the footsteps that had followed her, but there was nothing there, no sound, no movement, just rain and empty pavement. And that was somehow worse, because it meant whatever had been behind her had stopped, had chosen not to come closer, had chosen to wait, and people did not make choices like that unless something had made them. Her attention returned to Adrian, sharper now, more focused. "You have been waiting here," she said, not a question. His lips curved just enough to acknowledge the truth without fully confirming it. "I prefer to be early," he answered, and there it was again, that quiet authority, the sense that everything around him operated on a different set of rules. Claire felt a flicker of irritation cut through her caution, because she had no time for games, not tonight, not when her son was waiting, not when every second she stood here was another second she could not explain. "I do not need help," she said, firm, measured, the same tone she had used earlier that night when he had slid the envelope across the table at the cafe. The memory flashed between them like something unspoken but understood, his offer, her refusal, the way he had watched her walk away without trying to stop her, as if he had expected that answer all along. Adrian took a single step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, but enough to shift the distance between them into something more intentional. "I know," he said quietly, and that should have ended it, should have been the moment he turned and walked away like every other man who had ever realized she was not interested in being saved. But he did not move, did not leave, did not look away. Instead he studied her with a level of attention that made her feel seen in a way she had spent years avoiding, and that unsettled her more than fear ever could. Her phone buzzed again, louder this time in the silence between them, and she pulled it out instinctively, her screen lighting up with a message from the babysitter. "Ethan is asking for you. Is everything okay?" The words hit harder than they should have, because they reminded her exactly what she could not afford to risk. Claire locked the screen without replying, slipping the phone back into her pocket as she straightened her shoulders. "I have to go," she said, final, no hesitation, because whatever this was, whoever he was, none of it mattered more than getting home. Adrian's gaze flicked briefly to her pocket, then back to her face, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his expression, something quieter, less controlled. "Your son is waiting," he said, and Claire froze, not visibly, not in a way most people would notice, but inside, everything went still, because she had never told him that, had never said anything about Ethan, had never given him any reason to know, and yet he did. Of course he did, she thought, because men like him always knew more than they should. Her voice dropped, sharper now, edged with something close to warning. "You have no right to know that." Adrian did not react to the accusation, did not defend himself, he simply inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth without apologizing for it. "You are right," he said, and then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, "but the people who are following you tonight do not care about rights." Claire's breath caught, just for a second, because he said it so plainly, so casually, like it was not a possibility but a fact already decided, and suddenly the empty street behind her did not feel empty anymore, it felt watched, waiting, and Adrian gestured toward the open door of the SUV, the interior dim, quiet, controlled. "You can keep walking," he said, his voice even, giving her the illusion of choice, "or you can let me make sure you get home safely." And Claire stood there in the rain, weighing two dangers she did not fully understand, knowing that whichever choice she made, there was no going back to the simple version of her life she had just left behind. Claire stared at the open door of the SUV for 1 second too long, and she knew it, because hesitation was something she had trained out of herself years ago, back when every wrong pause had cost her something she could not afford to lose. But this was different. This was not a late bill or a missed shift. This was a choice that felt heavier than anything she could measure, and somewhere behind her, just out of sight, the silence pressed in again, reminding her that standing still was not safety, it was exposure. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag before she stepped forward, not because she trusted him, but because she trusted her instincts, and right now they were telling her something simple and unavoidable. The man in front of her was dangerous, but he was not the danger she had felt behind her. Adrian did not move as she approached, did not reach for her, did not rush her decision. He simply stepped aside enough to give her space, as if Control for him meant not needing to force anything at all. Claire paused at the edge of the open door, the faint warmth from inside the vehicle brushing against her rain-soaked skin, the contrast sharp enough to make her aware of how cold she had been until now. She glanced up at him one last time, searching for something she could define, something human, something predictable, but all she found was stillness, composed, unreadable, and somehow that steadiness made the choice easier. She ducked into the back seat without another word, the door closing behind her with a quiet, final sound that seemed to separate her from the street entirely. The rain became distant, muted, replaced by a controlled silence that felt almost unreal. Claire sat rigid for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, aware of every detail, the soft leather beneath her, the faint scent of something expensive and clean, the subtle hum of an engine that never seemed to strain. Adrian moved around the vehicle and slid into the front seat, not turning to face her, not immediately speaking, and that absence of pressure unsettled her more than any interrogation would have. The car began to move smoothly, merging into the wet streets as if it had always belonged there. Claire watched the city blur past the window, the reflection stretching and bending with the motion, her mind racing ahead, calculating the route, counting turns, recognizing streets she had walked 100 times, and then noticing something else. They were not taking the fastest way to her apartment, they were taking the safest, wider streets, better lit, less isolated. She frowned slightly, her voice cutting through the quiet. This is not the quickest route. Adrian's response came without hesitation, calm, precise. No, it is not, and nothing more, as if that answer alone should be enough. Claire leaned back slightly, tension still coiled in her shoulders. You said people were following me, she continued, watching his reflection faintly in the glass. Who? Adrian adjusted his cuff with deliberate ease, his tone unchanged. Men who do not like uncertainty, he said, and that vague answer only sharpened her focus. And I am uncertainty, she pressed. He glanced at her then, just briefly, but the weight of that look settled deeper than anything he had said so far. You refused money that would solve most problems, he replied. That makes you unpredictable. Claire let out a quiet breath, almost a humorless laugh. Or it makes me careful. Adrian's gaze returned to the road. Careful people still attract attention, he said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued around them, unaware of the quiet tension inside the vehicle. Claire's phone buzzed again, and this time she answered, pressing it to her ear, her voice softening instantly. I am on my way, she said, listening as the babysitter reassured her that Ethan was fine, just tired, just asking for her, just needing his mother the way children did without understanding the weight behind it. Claire closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in that reality, in something normal, something she could hold on to. 10 minutes, she promised, ending the call. Adrian did not comment, but something in the air shifted, like he had noted the change without needing to acknowledge it. The car slowed as they approached her neighborhood, the buildings more worn, the streets narrower, the lights less forgiving. Claire straightened slightly, tension returning. You can drop me here, she said, already reaching for the door handle before the vehicle had fully stopped. But Adrian's voice came again, quieter now, more precise. No, just that single word, not raised, not forceful, but absolute in a way that made her pause, her hand hovering. I will take you to your door, he continued, and Claire turned to look at him fully for the first time since getting inside, her eyes sharp, guarded. That is not necessary. Adrian met her gaze, steady, unwavering. It is, he said, and the simplicity of it made her chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from something she did not want to name, because for the first time in a long time, someone was not offering her a way out, or a transaction, or a favor. They were offering control, protection, something she had refused before, and now could not easily dismiss. The car turned onto her street, and Claire realized with a quiet certainty that whatever line she had just crossed, it was not one she could step back over. The car rolled to a smooth stop in front of Claire's apartment building, the old brick structure standing under a flickering streetlight that buzzed faintly in the rain, and for a moment neither of them moved, the engine still running, the quiet inside the vehicle pressing in again like something intentional. Claire reached for the door handle this time without hesitation, because whatever had just happened on the ride here, whatever shift had taken place, this was where her world existed, this building, this street, this life she had built piece by piece with nothing but exhaustion and determination. She stepped out into the rain, the cold hitting her instantly, grounding her, reminding her exactly who she was before she had stepped into his car, before everything had started to feel uncertain. She turned back slightly, expecting him to remain inside, to let the moment end cleanly, but the driver's door opened, and Adrian stepped out, his presence filling the narrow sidewalk in a way that made the space feel smaller, more controlled. Claire stopped halfway to the entrance, her voice firm despite the fatigue pulling at her. "You do not need to walk me any further." Adrian closed the door behind him with quiet precision, his gaze already scanning the building, the street, the shadows between parked cars, not with fear, but with assessment, like he was measuring something she could not see. "I know," he replied calmly, stepping forward anyway, and that simple contradiction tightened something in her chest, not anger, not exactly, but resistance, because she was used to being the one who decided how far people got, how close they were allowed, and right now that control was slipping in a way she did not understand. Claire walked toward the entrance without waiting for him, her keys already in her hand, her steps quick, focused, but she could feel him behind her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to disappear, just there, constant, steady, like something that had already decided its place in her world whether she agreed or not. She reached the door and unlocked it, pushing it open with a practiced motion. The dim hallway light spilling out onto the wet pavement, she stepped inside immediately. Turning back just enough to meet his gaze again. "This is far enough," she said, quieter now but no less firm. Adrian stopped just outside the doorway, the rain falling behind him in soft streaks, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, aware. "For tonight," he said, and the way he added those two words made the air shift again, like this was not an ending but a pause. Claire frowned slightly, something in her instinct reacting before her mind could catch up. "There is no next time," she replied, and she meant it, because that was how she survived, by drawing lines and refusing to let anyone cross them. Adrian's gaze held hers for a second longer, and then he did something unexpected. He nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like he respected the boundary even if he did not believe it would hold. "Lock your door," he said simply, and there was no command in it, no pressure, just a statement that felt heavier than it should have. Claire hesitated for the briefest moment, then turned and stepped fully inside, pulling the door closed behind her, the sound echoing slightly in the narrow hallway. She stood there for a second, her back against the door, listening, expecting something, a knock, a voice, anything, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the building, the distant sound of a television from another apartment, the familiar normalcy she had fought to maintain. She exhaled slowly, pushing herself away from the door and moving down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the worn floor, the scent of home settling around her. She reached her apartment and unlocked it quickly, stepping inside to find the small living room dimly lit, the babysitter rising from the couch with a relieved smile. "He finally fell asleep," she said quietly, and Claire nodded, her tension easing just enough to let her breathe again. She thanked her, paid her, and watched as the door closed once more, leaving her alone in the quiet space she knew so well. Claire moved down the short hallway to Ethan's room, pushing the door open gently, the soft glow of a nightlight casting warm shadows across the walls. Her son lay curled under his blanket, one hand resting near his face, his breathing steady, peaceful, untouched by the storm outside or the choices she had just made. Claire stepped closer, brushing a damp strand of hair away from his forehead, her chest tightening with something deeper than exhaustion, something protective, something fierce. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting that feeling settle, grounding herself in what mattered, in who mattered, and then, as she stood and moved back toward the living room, she felt it again, that same quiet awareness she had felt earlier in the alley, not fear, not exactly, but presence. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside just slightly, looking down at the street below, and there it was, the black SUV, still parked under the flickering light, engine running, unmoving, waiting, and Claire's breath caught just enough to matter, because she realized something then, something she could not ignore. He had not left, and for the first time, she was not sure if that made her safer, or if it meant she had just stepped into something far more complicated than she was ready for. Claire did not let the curtain fall immediately, her fingers holding the fabric just enough to keep the narrow gap open as she watched the black SUV idling below, the engine's low hum barely visible but somehow present in the stillness of the street, the flickering streetlight casting uneven shadows across the hood, making the vehicle look less like a car and more like something waiting with purpose. She told herself it meant nothing, that men like him lived in motion, that they did not linger without reason, and yet he was still there, unmoving, as if leaving was not part of the plan. Claire let the curtain slip back into place slowly, her mind already pushing against the thought, rejecting it, because she could not afford to make space for something she did not understand. Not when her life depended on predictability, routine, control. She moved through her apartment quietly, the familiar layout grounding her, the worn couch, the small kitchen table with unpaid bills stacked neatly to one side, the faint hum of the refrigerator, everything exactly where it should be, everything earned, nothing given. She paused near the sink, resting her hands against the counter, staring down at nothing for a moment as the night replayed in fragments she could not quite organize. The alley, the footsteps, the car, his voice, the way he had said her son was waiting like it was something obvious, something he had the right to know. She exhaled slowly, pushing herself upright, because thinking too long about things she could not control had never helped her before. She turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway again, stopping briefly at Ethan's door, listening to his steady breathing, letting it anchor her one more time before she stepped back into the living room. But the awareness had not left, it lingered just beneath the surface, quiet, persistent, like something that refused to be ignored. Claire crossed back to the window, slower this time, more deliberate, and pulled the curtain aside again, just enough to see. The SUV was still there, exactly where it had been, as if time had not moved for it at all. Her jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of frustration breaking through her composure, because this was not normal. This was not something she could explain away with logic or routine, and yet she refused to let it become fear, because fear led to mistakes, and mistakes were not something she could afford, not with Ethan, not with everything balanced so carefully on her ability to keep going. She stepped back from the window this time, forcing herself to turn away, to focus on what she could control. She moved to the small table, sorting through the bills with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving automatically, calculating, prioritizing, ignoring the numbers that did not add up the way they should, until a soft sound broke through the quiet, a small voice from the hallway. "Mom." Claire turned instantly, her focus shifting completely as Ethan stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his blanket dragging slightly behind him. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps, kneeling in front of him, her expression softening in a way it never did for anyone else. "Hey. You should be sleeping," she said gently, brushing his hair back. Ethan leaned into her without hesitation, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "I heard the rain," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Claire held him close, steady, present. "It is just a storm," she murmured, rocking him slightly, the simple motion easing something inside her she had not realized was still tense. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face with the quiet awareness children sometimes had without understanding it. "Are you okay?" he asked, and for a moment, Claire did not answer, because she did not know how to explain something she did not understand herself. She smiled instead, soft, reassuring, the kind of smile she had perfected over years of hiding everything that did not belong in his world. "I am right here," she said, and that was enough for him. It always was. She guided him back to his bed, tucking the blanket around him carefully, waiting until his breathing slowed again, until sleep pulled him under completely, and only then did she stand, moving back into the living room once more, drawn again to the window like something unfinished. She hesitated this time before looking, just for a second, as if part of her already knew what she would see, and when she finally pulled the curtain aside, the street below was empty, the SUV gone. The space it had occupied now just another quiet stretch of pavement under a flickering light. Claire stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, her thoughts catching up slowly, because the absence felt heavier than the presence had, more final, more deliberate, like something had changed without her seeing exactly when. She let the curtain fall back into place, her reflection faint in the glass for a second before it disappeared, and for the first time that night, the silence inside her apartment did not feel like safety, it felt like the calm after something had already begun. Claire did not sleep much that night, not because of the storm or the lingering chill that had settled into her bones, but because her mind refused to settle into anything familiar. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the empty street where the SUV had been, the space it left behind sharper than its presence had been, like a question she could not answer. She lay still for a long time, listening to the quiet breathing of her son through the thin wall, grounding herself in that rhythm. Reminding herself that morning would come, that routine would take over, that whatever had happened would fade into something she could categorize and ignore, and eventually, exhaustion won, not peace, not comfort, just the simple weight of too many hours without rest pulling her under. When her alarm went off at 6 a.m., the sound was sharp, immediate, dragging her back into motion before she could think too much about anything else. Claire sat up slowly, pressing her hand to her temple for a second as the dull ache settled in, then she pushed herself out of bed, because hesitation had never been an option for her. The apartment was quiet in that early morning way, the city outside just beginning to wake, distant traffic, the low hum of life restarting. She moved through her routine with practiced precision, coffee brewing, toast in a small toaster, Ethan's lunch packed in a worn container that had seen better days. Everything measured, everything timed. She woke him gently, her voice soft, steady, guiding him through the motions of getting ready, and for a while, everything felt normal again, almost enough to convince her that the night before had been exaggerated by exhaustion, until she reached for her bag near the door and noticed it, an envelope, simple, unmarked, resting exactly where it had not been before. Claire froze for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering above it, because she knew immediately what it meant, not how it got there, not when, but who. She glanced toward the door, checking the lock instinctively, still secure, still exactly as she had left it, no signs of anything out of place, and yet the envelope remained, real, undeniable. Ethan's voice pulled her attention back, asking a question about school, about something small and ordinary, and she answered automatically, her tone steady, her expression unchanged, because whatever this was, it did not belong in his world. She picked up the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but significant, like it carried more than just paper. She slipped it into her bag without opening it, because she did not need to see what was inside to know what it represented: control, access, a line being crossed without permission. She finished getting Ethan ready, walking him to the bus stop as she did every morning, her eyes more alert now, scanning without appearing to, noting every car, every passerby, every detail that might have shifted, but the street looked the same, ordinary, predictable. The bus arrived, Ethan climbed on with a small wave, and she returned it, her smile genuine, steady, because for him, everything was still simple, still safe, still untouched. Claire waited until the bus disappeared before turning back toward her building, her pace slower now, more deliberate, the envelope in her bag heavier with every step. When she reached her apartment again, she closed the door behind her and locked it carefully. Standing there for a moment as the silence settled, she moved to the table and set her bag down, pulling the envelope out and placing it in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on the edge. She did not open it right away, instead she stared at it, as if giving herself one last moment before everything shifted again, because opening it would mean acknowledging that last night had not ended when she closed her door. It had followed her, crossed into her space, her life, her boundaries. Claire exhaled slowly, then slid her finger under the seal and opened it. Inside was not cash, not this time, but a single card, heavy paper, embossed lettering, a phone number written neatly beneath a name she already knew, Adrian Volkov, and below it, just one line, simple, precise, unmistakable: for when you realize this is not about money. Claire stared at the words, her jaw tightening slightly as the meaning settled in, because this was not an offer, not anymore, it was a statement, a shift from transaction to something else entirely, something she had not agreed to, and yet could not easily refuse. She picked up the card, turning it between her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the intention behind it, and for the first time that morning, she allowed herself to think the one thing she had been avoiding since the night before: he was not going to leave her alone. Claire did not call the number that morning, not because she was not tempted, but because she understood exactly what calling it would mean. It would not be a conversation, not really, it would be an acceptance, an opening, a quiet admission that she was willing to step into something she could not control, and control was the only thing that had kept her life from falling apart. She placed the card back into the envelope and slid it into the bottom of her bag, out of sight, not out of mind. Then grabbed her keys and stepped out into the day, the city already alive with movement, people rushing, cars passing, everything loud and ordinary in a way that almost made the night before feel distant, but not quite. She walked to the cafe with the same steady pace she always used, her posture composed, her expression neutral, because no one here needed to know that anything had changed. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and baked goods wrapped around her, the low hum of conversation filling the space, grounding her in routine. She tied on her apron, moved behind the counter, and let the rhythm take over, orders, movements, small exchanges, everything predictable, everything safe, until the door opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to shift the energy in a way only she seemed to notice at first. Claire did not look up immediately, she did not need to. Her body recognized the change before her eyes did, the subtle silence that followed, the way voices dipped slightly, the way attention redirected without anyone acknowledging it, and then she looked. Adrian Volkov stepped inside like he belonged there, like every space he entered adjusted itself to accommodate him, his presence controlled, deliberate, his gaze already finding her across the room without searching. Claire felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate. She straightened slightly, forcing her hands to remain steady as she finished the drink she was preparing, placing it on the counter with practiced ease before stepping forward, her voice calm, measured. "We are open," she said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than they should have. Adrian's lips curved just enough to acknowledge the statement, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could define. "I am aware," he replied, his tone even, and the way he said it made it clear he was not here by accident. Claire held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gestured toward the menu. "What would you like?" she asked. Keeping it professional, keeping it distant, Adrian stepped closer, the space between them narrowing just enough to feel intentional. "Coffee," he said, and it sounded less like an order and more like an excuse. Claire nodded once, turning away to prepare it, her movements precise, controlled, but her awareness remained fixed on him, on the way he stood there, not impatient, not distracted, simply present, watching. When she placed the cup in front of him, their fingers did not touch, but the space between them felt charged anyway. "That will be $3, she said, and the normalcy of the number almost felt absurd. Adrian reached into his jacket, placing a bill on the counter. "More than enough." Claire glanced at it, then back at him, her expression unchanged. "Exact change only," she said, sliding the bill back toward him without hesitation, a quiet line drawn. Adrian looked at the bill, then at her, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression, not annoyance, not surprise, but something closer to recognition, like she had confirmed something he already believed. He replaced the bill with exact change without argument, his movements just as controlled as hers. Claire took it, placing it in the register before stepping back slightly, maintaining distance, maintaining boundaries. Adrian picked up the cup but did not leave. Instead, he spoke again, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the counter. "You received my message." Claire met his gaze directly this time, no hesitation, no avoidance. "I did not ask for one," she replied, her tone steady, and that was the truth, the only truth she was willing to offer. Adrian nodded once, as if that answer was expected. "And yet you read it," he said, not accusing, not pressing, just stating a fact. Claire exhaled slowly, the tension between them tightening just enough to matter. "That does not change anything," she said, and she meant it. She needed to mean it. Adrian studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp, assessing, and then he set the cup down untouched, his gaze holding hers as he spoke, quieter now, more precise. "It changes everything," and the certainty in his voice made the space between them feel smaller, heavier, like something had already shifted whether she accepted it or not. Claire felt it then. That same quiet pull she had been resisting since the night before, the sense that this was no longer something she could ignore, and for the first time, she realized that refusing him might not be enough to keep him out of her life. Claire did not respond immediately, not because she did not have something to say, but because she understood that every word she chose right now would either reinforce the line she had drawn or weaken it, and she could not afford to weaken anything, not in front of him, not in front of someone who seemed to read hesitation as opportunity. She straightened slightly behind the counter, her posture firm, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "No, it does not," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence was deliberate. She was not going to explain herself, not going to justify a decision that had already been made. Adrian watched her for a moment longer, not with impatience, not with frustration, but with that same quiet focus that made it feel like he was seeing something beyond her words, something she could not hide even if she tried, and then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the coffee again, lifting it slowly as if the conversation had shifted into something else. Entirely, he took a single sip, measured, controlled, and set the cup back down, untouched beyond that. "You are careful," he said, and it was not a compliment, not entirely. Claire did not react, but inside, the words settled deeper than she wanted them to, because they were true, and truth coming from someone like him felt like exposure. "That has kept you safe so far," he continued, his tone even, almost observational. "But it will not be enough this time." Claire's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter, the smallest reaction, barely visible, but she felt it, the shift from controlled conversation into something closer to warning. "You do not get to decide what is enough for me," she replied, her voice still steady, but sharper now. Adrian did not interrupt, did not challenge her directly. Instead he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them. "No," he said quietly, "I decide what becomes a problem," and the weight of that statement lingered between them, not loud, not aggressive, but certain in a way that made it difficult to ignore. Claire held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give him that advantage, even as something in her instinct told her that this was not a game she could win by standing still. The cafe moved around them, customers talking, cups clinking, the normal rhythm continuing as if nothing unusual was happening, and that contrast made the moment feel even sharper, like they were standing in a space separate from everything else. "Then you should find another problem," she said, her voice quieter now, controlled, but firm. Adrian's expression did not change, but there was a flicker there, brief, almost imperceptible, something that looked less like resistance and more like interest, like she had just confirmed something he had already been testing. He reached into his pocket again, not for money this time, but for a small object he placed gently on the counter between them, a simple key, metal, unmarked. Claire's eyes dropped to it for a second before returning to his face, her confusion immediate but contained. "What is that?" she asked. Adrian did not answer right away, giving the silence just enough time to build. "A choice," he said finally, and the word settled heavier than it should have. Claire's brow tightened slightly. "I already made mine," she replied. Adrian shook his head once, slowly. "No," he said, his voice softer now, more precise. "You made a decision based on what you understood yesterday." He paused, just long enough for the meaning to shift. "This is for when you understand more." Claire stared at the key again, her mind moving quickly, trying to place it, to define it, to turn it into something simple she could reject, but it refused to fit into anything familiar, and that unsettled her more than anything he had said so far. She did not reach for it, did not move, holding her ground even as the tension built. Adrian stepped back then, finally creating space between them, his presence retreating just enough to remind her how much it had filled it before. "Keep it," he said, not a command, not a request, just a statement. Claire did not respond, her eyes still fixed on him, searching for something she could use, something she could push against, but he had already turned, already moving toward the door with the same controlled ease he had entered with, and just before he reached it, he stopped, not looking back immediately, but speaking in a voice that carried just enough to reach her without drawing attention. "You think refusing me protects your independence," he said, then glanced over his shoulder, his eyes finding hers one last time. "It only limits your options," and with that, he walked out into the daylight, the door closing behind him as the normal noise of the cafe rushed back in, filling the space he had left. Claire stood there for a long moment, the key still resting on the counter, small, simple, and impossible to ignore, because she understood something now that she had not wanted to admit before. This was no longer about money, and it was no longer something she could end just by saying no. Claire did not touch the key for a long time after he left, not because she was afraid of it, but because she understood exactly what it represented. Not an object, not even an offer, but access, a door she had not agreed to open. She continued working, moving through orders, conversations, routine, her hands steady, her voice calm, but her awareness never left that small piece of metal resting on the counter. It felt out of place, too intentional, like it carried weight that the rest of the room could not see. Eventually, one of her coworkers reached for it absent-mindedly, assuming it had been left behind, and Claire reacted instantly. her hand closing over it before the other woman could pick it up, the movement sharper than she intended. "It is mine," she said quickly, her tone softer a second later to smooth over the moment, but the reaction lingered, even in her own mind, because she had claimed something she had not accepted, and that contradiction unsettled her more than anything else. She slipped the key into her apron pocket, out of sight, but not out of reach, and forced herself to focus on the rest of her shift, telling herself that this was still her space, her rules, her life, unchanged, but the certainty did not feel as solid as it had before. When her shift finally ended, the afternoon light had softened into something quieter, the city moving at a slower pace. Claire stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment, scanning instinctively, not out of fear, but habit, and everything looked normal. People passing, cars moving, nothing out of place, no black SUV, no sign of him, and yet the absence did not bring relief. It brought something else, something harder to define, like she was aware of something beyond what she could see. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started walking toward the bus stop, her steps measured, her posture composed, the key in her pocket pressing lightly against the fabric. A constant reminder she could not ignore. She told herself she would throw it away, that she would find a trash can and be done with it, that this was the simplest solution, the only one that made sense. But when she passed the first one, she did not stop. When she reached the second, she kept walking, and by the time she noticed, she was already at the bus stop, standing among strangers, her fingers brushing against the edge of the key through the fabric like it had anchored itself there. She exhaled slowly, frustration flickering beneath her calm, because this was not who she was. She did not hesitate, she did not carry things she did not need, she did not allow anyone to complicate her life like this. The bus arrived, and she stepped on, taking a seat near the back, her gaze drifting toward the window as the city moved past, reflections blending with reality, her thoughts circling the same point without resolution. What did the key open? Why give it to her? Why not explain? But she already knew the answer to that, because explanation would make it easier to refuse, and he was not interested in making anything easier for her. He was interested in control, in shifting her choices until the path he wanted was the only one that made sense. Claire closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself, reminding herself of what mattered: Ethan, her home, the life she had built. She reached into her pocket and pulled the key out, holding it in her palm, turning it slightly between her fingers. It was simple, unmarked, offering no answers, just possibility, and that was what made it dangerous, because possibility meant change, and change was not something she had room for, not now, not ever. The bus slowed as it approached her stop, and Claire slipped the key back into her pocket. Her decision still unmade, still unresolved. She stepped off the bus and walked toward her building, her step steady, controlled, but the weight in her pocket remained, quiet, persistent, like something waiting. And as she reached her door and unlocked it, stepping inside the familiar space that had always been enough, she realized something she had not wanted to admit. The problem was no longer whether she would use the key, it was whether she could ignore it, and for the first time, she was not sure she could. Claire closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment, her hand resting against the lock as if confirming it was real, solid, unchanged, because everything else felt like it had shifted in ways she could not fully see yet. The apartment was quiet again, the same familiar silence that had always meant safety, but now it carried something else beneath it, something unsettled, like the echo of a decision she had not made. She moved further inside, setting her bag down on the table, her fingers brushing against the fabric where the key rested, and this time she did not avoid it. She reached in and pulled it out, placing it in front of her, the metal catching the soft light from the window, simple, unmarked, offering nothing but questions. Claire stared at it for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities, not emotionally, not impulsively, but carefully, the way she approached everything. Because every choice she made had consequences she had to carry. She paced once across the small room, then back again, the movement slow, controlled, her thoughts aligning piece by piece. He had not forced her, not once, he had not threatened, had not demanded, he had simply positioned himself in her path, offered something she did not want, and then waited, and that waiting was what unsettled her the most, because it meant he was certain she would eventually come to him on her own. Claire stopped at the window, glancing down at the street out of habit, but it was empty, nothing unusual, nothing to confirm or deny the presence she had felt since the night before. She turned back toward the table, her gaze settling on the key again, and this time, she picked it up without hesitation, holding it firmly in her hand, because avoiding it was no longer an option. Ignoring it had not made it disappear, it had only made it heavier. She needed to understand it, define it, turn it into something she could control. She grabbed her phone from her bag and unlocked it, her thumb hovering for a second before she opened the map application, typing nothing at first, just staring at the blank search bar. Then she stopped, because she already knew there would be no address attached to the key, no simple answer waiting to be found that way. She lowered the phone slightly, her mind shifting direction, thinking instead about him, about the way he operated, controlled, precise, intentional. He would not give her something meaningless. The key had purpose, it opened something specific, something chosen, something he wanted her to find when she was ready, not before. Claire exhaled slowly, the realization settling in. This was not about solving a puzzle, it was about making a decision, and she had been avoiding that since the moment she stepped into his car. Her gaze moved toward Ethan's room, the door slightly open, the soft sound of him moving inside reminding her of exactly what mattered, what every decision came back to: safety, stability, control. She closed her eyes for a second, grounding herself in that thought, then opened them again, clearer now, more focused. She picked up her bag and slipped the key back inside, not hidden this time, not pushed away, but kept, acknowledged, because whether she liked it or not, it was now part of her reality. She moved toward the door, her movement steady, purposeful, grabbing her jacket as she went, because sitting here thinking would not give her answers, and waiting would not change anything. She needed to see, to understand, to confront whatever this was before it grew into something she could not manage. She paused at the door for just a second, her hand on the handle, her breath even controlled, and then she opened it and stepped out into the hallway, the decision made without words, because she realized something she could not ignore anymore. If he believed she would come to him eventually, then the only way to prove him wrong was to face it on her terms, not his. And for the first time since this began, Claire was not reacting, she was choosing, even if she did not yet know where that choice would lead. Claire did not rush as she stepped out of the building, her pace steady, controlled, because whatever she was about to do, it was not something she would approach with panic or uncertainty. The late afternoon air carried a quiet tension she could not explain, the kind that made everything feel slightly sharper, more defined, as if the city itself was watching. She adjusted her jacket and started walking, not toward the cafe, not toward the bus stop, but toward the part of the city she rarely visited, the part where buildings stood taller, cleaner, more distant from the life she knew. She did not know exactly where she was going, but she understood one thing clearly: if the key meant anything, it would lead her somewhere that did not belong to her world. Her fingers brushed against it inside her bag as she walked, not nervously, not uncertainly, but deliberately, like a reminder that this was her choice now, not his. The streets changed gradually as she moved, storefronts replaced by glass facades, quiet sidewalks replacing crowded corners, everything more controlled, more curated, and with each step, the distance between her life and this one became more visible, more undeniable. Claire slowed slightly as she reached an intersection she had only ever passed by before, her eyes lifting to the building across the street, tall, modern, guarded not by obvious security but by presence alone. The kind of place that did not need signs to tell you it was not for everyone. She stopped at the curb, her gaze steady as she studied it, something in her instinct tightening just enough to confirm what she already suspected. This was not random, nothing about him was random. She crossed the street when the light changed, her steps measured, her posture straight, refusing to let the difference between her and this place show in any visible way. The entrance doors were glass, clean, reflective, showing her own image back at her for a second. Damp hair now dry, simple clothes, nothing remarkable, nothing that belonged here, and yet she did not stop. She stepped inside, the shift immediate, the air cooler, quieter, the sound of the city cut off as if it had never existed. The lobby was expansive but minimal, polished floors, controlled lighting, everything intentional. A man behind the front desk looked up as she entered, his expression professional but alert. Assessing, Claire walked forward without hesitation, her voice calm when she spoke. "I am here to see someone," she said, not offering a name yet, not giving more than necessary. The man studied her for a second, then glanced briefly at something on his desk, a screen she could not see, before looking back at her, and in that moment, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, recognition, not of her, but of why she was here. "Of course," he said, his tone changing just enough to matter. "Please take the elevator to the top floor." Claire did not ask how he knew, did not question it, because she already understood. This had been arranged, expected, part of something she had stepped into the moment she chose to come here. She nodded once and turned toward the elevators, her reflection catching briefly in the mirrored surface as the doors opened. She stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor without hesitation, the doors closing smoothly behind her, sealing her into the quiet, controlled space. The elevator began to rise, steady, silent, and for the first time since leaving her apartment, Claire allowed herself to feel it fully, not fear, not doubt, but the weight of the moment, because there was no turning back from this, no pretending it did not matter. She was walking into his world now, not by force, not by accident, but by choice, and as the numbers climbed, each floor passing with quiet precision, she realized something that settled deep in her chest. Whatever waited for her at the top, it was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be something she could walk away from unchanged. The elevator slowed with a soft, controlled motion, the subtle shift in movement signaling arrival before the doors even opened, and Claire felt it in her chest, that quiet tightening that came not from fear, but from awareness, the kind that told her she had reached a point where everything ahead would matter. The doors slid apart smoothly, revealing a space that did not resemble an office or a typical floor, but something more deliberate, more private, the lighting softer, the air still, the silence intentional. She stepped out without hesitation, her posture straight, her movements measured, because whatever this was, she would not enter it uncertain. The hallway ahead was short, leading directly to a single door at the far end, dark wood, simple, without markings, without a handle visible from where she stood, as if it did not need one. Claire walked toward it slowly, each step echoing faintly against the polished floor, her reflection briefly catching in the glass panels lining the side wall, reminding her again of the contrast between where she came from and where she stood now. But she did not stop, did not second-guess, because turning back now would mean admitting that she had come here without the resolve to follow through, and that was not something she allowed herself to do. She reached the door and paused for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but to steady the moment, then raised her hand and knocked once, firm, controlled, the sound carrying just enough to break the silence without disturbing it. There was no immediate response, no voice from inside, just a brief stillness that stretched long enough to make the moment feel deliberate, and then the door unlocked with a quiet click, opening inward on its own, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to invite her in. Claire stepped forward, crossing the threshold without hesitation, the space inside larger than she expected but not overwhelming, designed with the same precision she had begun to recognize, everything placed with intention, clean lines, muted tones. A wide window stretching across one side of the room revealing the city below, distant now, reduced to something small and controlled, and standing near that window, his back partially turned as if he had been watching the skyline, was Adrian Volkov. He did not turn immediately when she entered, as if he had already known she would be there, as if her arrival had been part of the structure of this moment from the beginning. Claire stopped a few feet inside the room, the door closing quietly behind her, sealing the space, the sound soft but final, and only then did he move, turning slowly to face her, his expression composed, unreadable, but his eyes sharp, focused, meeting hers without hesitation. "You found it," he said, his voice calm, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging something that had already been expected. Claire held his gaze, her stance firm, refusing to let the setting or his presence dictate her position. "You made sure I would," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, just honest. Adrian stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them slightly, not enough to crowd her, but enough to make the interaction intentional. "No," he said quietly, "I made sure you had the option," and that distinction settled between them, subtle but important. Claire's fingers tightened slightly at her side, her awareness sharp. "You do not give options without expecting a result," she said. Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something like acknowledgement passing through his eyes. "I expect clarity," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made it harder to challenge. because it did not sound like control, even though it was. Claire took a slow breath, steadying herself, because this was the moment she had come for, not the building, not the key, but this, understanding what he wanted, defining the line he kept approaching. Then be clear, she said. Her voice quiet but firm. What is this? Adrian studied her for a moment. Not rushing the answer, not filling the silence unnecessarily, and when he spoke, his voice was lower now, more precise. This is the point where you decide whether you continue pretending you are not being watched, he said, and the words settled heavily, not as a threat, but as a truth she could not easily dismiss. Claire's expression did not change, but inside, something shifted, because she had felt it, the presence, the awareness, the subtle changes she could not explain. And if I decide I am not, she asked. Adrian held her gaze, steady, unwavering. Then you walk out that door, he said, and you hope nothing happens that forces you to reconsider. The silence that followed was different, heavier, not because of what he said, but because of what he did not say, and Claire realized then that this was not about convincing her, it was about letting her see what he already knew, and decide whether she was willing to face it alone, or step into something she had spent her entire life avoiding. And for the first time since she walked into that alley, the choice in front of her felt real, not forced, not manipulated, but unavoidable in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Claire did not answer immediately, not because she did not understand what he was offering, but because she understood it too well. The room felt still around her, the city stretching far below the glass behind him, distant, controlled, like everything he touched eventually became. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, because this was the moment that mattered. Not the key, not the building, but this. The decision he had been guiding her toward since the beginning. You are asking me to trust you, she said finally, her voice calm, but weighted with everything that word carried. Adrian did not move, did not soften, his expression unchanged as he answered. No, he said quietly, I am asking you to recognize what is already happening, and that difference settled between them, sharp and undeniable. Claire exhaled slowly, her mind working through every piece of the past 24 hours, the alley, the footsteps, the envelope, the key, the way doors had opened without question, the way people had already known she was coming. None of it had been random, none of it had been accidental. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window, the city below moving in patterns she could not control, could not predict, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been resisting. Her life had been stable, yes, but it had never been protected. She had survived by managing risk, not eliminating it, and now someone was offering to remove that uncertainty entirely, not for free, not without consequence, but with a clarity she could not ignore. She turned back to him, her expression sharper now, more defined. And what do you get? She asked, because she needed that answer more than anything else, needed to understand the cost before she even considered the benefit. Adrian watched her for a moment, longer this time, as if measuring how much truth to give. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. Peace of mind, he said, and the simplicity of it almost felt like deflection, but the way he held her gaze made it clear he meant it. Claire frowned slightly, not convinced. That is not enough, she replied. Adrian stepped closer then, not abruptly, not forcefully, but enough to narrow the space between them into something more personal, more direct. You are not like the others, he said, and there was no performance in his voice, no manipulation she could easily detect, just certainty. You do not ask for anything. You do not take what is offered, you endure. He paused, just long enough for the words to settle, and that makes you unpredictable. Claire felt the words land, not as flattery, but as recognition, the same way he had seen her in the cafe, the same way he had understood something about her she had not said out loud. Unpredictable is not something people like you usually tolerate, she said quietly. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, something almost like a restrained acknowledgement. No, he agreed, but it is something I respect. The silence that followed was different now, less about tension and more about weight, the kind that comes when both sides understand what is being offered. Claire looked at him, really looked this time, past the control, past the power, searching for something she could define, something she could trust, and she realized something unexpected. He was not trying to convince her, he was waiting for her to decide, because he believed she would, eventually. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, because this was not a decision she could make lightly, not with Ethan, not with everything tied to her ability to remain independent, but independence had never guaranteed safety, it had only guaranteed that she faced everything alone. Her fingers curled slightly at her side, grounding her in the moment. "If I say no," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you walk away." Adrian did not answer immediately. And that pause told her more than any words could have. When he finally spoke, his tone was unchanged. Calm, precise. "If you say no," he said, "I make sure you have the chance to say yes later." And that was it. Not a threat, not a promise, just a statement of how this would continue. Claire felt the truth of it settle deep, because it meant this would not end here, not completely, not cleanly. She looked toward the door briefly, the path out still open, still available, and then back at him, her decision not fully spoken, not finalized, but forming in a way she could not stop anymore. "Then this is not a choice," she said. Adrian held her gaze, unwavering. "It is," he replied softly, "just not the kind you are used to." And in that moment, Claire understood, this was not about being forced, it was about being changed. About stepping into something that would alter the way she lived, the way she protected what mattered, the way she defined control itself. She did not move toward the door, and she did not step closer either. She simply stood there, the space between them holding the weight of everything unspoken, because for the first time, she was not deciding whether to refuse him, she was deciding whether she was willing to stop doing everything alone. And as the silence stretched, steady and unbroken, Claire realized something she could not ignore anymore. Saying no had always been her way of staying safe, but this time, it might be the thing that left her exposed.